Alright, in this second video, we're going to take a look at the judicial branch of government and the checks and balances and see how that works, and some other powers set aside by the U.S. Constitution. So let's start with the judicial branch. The judicial branch that establishes the federal courts in America. There's two types of courts in America. There's federal courts and there's state courts. Federal courts operate and look at the laws put out by the federal government, and state courts look at the laws put out by the state governments. State courts also deal with local municipalities and their courts as well. The highest court in the land in terms of the federal government is the Supreme Court. Every state also has its own Supreme Court, which is the highest court for that state. This is the Supreme Court building where the most important court cases in American history are heard. The Supreme Court consists of 9 justices. These are the judges that sit on the Supreme Court, and there's 9 of them, so there can never be a tie between them. There can be splits, of course, between them, but never a tie. A justice is appointed by the president, but he has to be, or she has to be, approved by the Senate. And this not only means the justices of the Supreme Court, but all federal judges, no matter where they sit across the country. The president decides who should get that appointment, and then the Senate decides if they really should. The president will usually appoint these people based on similar political beliefs, or sometimes the president sort of knows what may be coming up to the Supreme Court, what cases they may be hearing, and if they want them to go one way or the other, they try to stack the Supreme Court with justices that serve on their side. What's interesting is that justices serve a life term, and they can't be replaced unless they do something that's extremely bad, treason or murder, something like that, which doesn't happen. But usually they serve for life. And in the beginning of our country, that's exactly what they did. They just served for life, for life, for life. They would die being a justice. Nowadays, most justices are smart enough to know when it is time for them to retire, and they can retire. Sometimes retirements are planned to correspond with who's president, and probably be interesting. Barack Obama has appointed 1 Supreme Court justice. It's very possible he could appoint a second before his term is up. There are a couple justices that might retire. George Bush was lucky enough not only to appoint justices, but to appoint the Chief Justice. The Chief Justice is one position of the Supreme Court, and it's one person who serves for life. It's not like the other justices rotate into the Chief Justice position. So George Bush was able to appoint somebody who is fairly young in terms of a justice, probably sit on the court for a very, very long time. But just because you appoint somebody doesn't mean that they'll always vote the way that your political party thinks that they should vote. That was the case recently with the Chief Justice who voted to strike down the DOMA law, the Defense of Marriage Act. Republicans did not want it struck down, but the Chief Justice, who was appointed by a Republican president, decided that this law is unconstitutional. So they weren't too happy about that. So again, there's 9 of them in terms of the Supreme Court, and then there's the judges all over the place, and they serve for life. This same article that defines what the Supreme Court is also defines what treason is. And treason is basically selling out your country specifically to an enemy. Treason comes into play a lot during wartime. It also came in, it was a big part of the play during the Cold War. The Cold War was that period when the Soviet Union existed and the United States were the 2 superpowers of the world, and they had different ideological views, and they never saw eye to eye, and they actually differed on just about everything. We planted spies in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union planted spies in America. Um, things like that. And if those spies were found out, they could, if they were American citizens, could be executed. You can be executed for treason. It used to be by firing squad, especially soldiers who committed treason. Um, Nowadays, they're electrocuted, which was the case of the Rosenbergs. Ethel Rosenberg and her husband were convicted of treason for selling things to the Soviet Union, actually, and they were electrocuted for their crimes, which was unfortunate. Um, Recently, there were a bunch of Russian spies found out in America, and they were deported. They're not American citizens, so we can't hold them. They're still Russian citizens, and they were deported. The television program, The Americans, which is on American television now, depicts life in the 70s. 70s, yeah, 70s, late 70s, of two Soviet Union spies who have infiltrated American soil and literally have set up like they're a family. They have two children. They own a travel agency, but yet they're spies for the Soviet Union and what life was like for them. And then sometimes, especially when a spy came to America, it was such a different way of life and such a more open and free way of life. The conflicts that sometimes rose up in these actual spies. And this television program does a good job of showing this. It's a very good program if you ever get a chance to watch it. So that's the judicial part, the branch of government. Now, so let's talk about some other things, specifically the checks and balances. This is a very, very important concept. When the U.S. Constitution was being drafted in 1787, it was very much on everybody's mind that one of the reasons we had this huge problem was because of the monarchy in Britain. The monarchy, over historical periods of time, the monarchy in Britain has lost significant powers, but they still hold a lot of powers, especially in 1776 when the revolution broke out. And King George, who was the king at the time of the revolution, he very much wanted to control the colonies and make them his own. I mean, many kings at this time thought that having colonies would make them rich. And that was one of King George's thoughts. And so he probably treated the colonists worse than they should have been. And we wanted to make sure that no one power, because if you think about the British system, it consists of the monarchy, the House of Commons, and the House of Lords. But in that case, the monarchy was much more powerful than either the House of Commons and House of Lords. We wanted to make sure that none of that could happen in our country. We wanted to make sure that the Congress could not take control. The president cannot just become a dictator. Make sure that the courts can't determine that the Congress is not good and get rid of them, and make sure that the military can't form a coup, which often happens in countries that don't have this checks and balances in place. So you have this checks and balances. So, for example, Congress, they approve all the presidential nominations. So the president will nominate somebody to his cabinet or nominate a federal judge or a justice, but the Congress gets the final say. And if the Congress says, no, you know what? We don't like this person. We're not approving him. Then the president has to appoint somebody else. And this has happened where Supreme Court justices and cabinet members have not been approved by Congress, and then this stalls the presidential process. The Congress also approves the budget. So it decides how much money each department, including all the departments under the executive branch, get. The legislative branch can override a veto of the president. When the president receives a law from the Congress, they can sign it or they can veto it. If they sign it, the bill becomes a law. If they veto it, then they say, nope, I don't like it. Either take this law back and rework it or get rid of it totally. Well, if a president vetoes a law, then the legislative branch can override that veto. And that's the actual term, override the veto. To do so, they need a two-thirds majority of the combined houses to override a presidential veto. So it's a lot of people they actually need. And if for some reason the one of the two houses is controlled by the president's own political party, then chances are they're not going to override the veto. But they can try to override the president's veto. And of course, the legislative branch can remove the president from office, can impeach him if he is guilty of treason or bribery or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So Congress has that check on the executive branch. At the same time, Congress has a check on the Supreme Court. They can confirm the presidential nominations for justices and judges. That is, if the president decides that this person should be a justice on the Supreme Court, that person has to go to a hearing in front of Congress, and Congress has the ultimate say. If the Congress votes no, then that person cannot become a Chief Justice, and the president has to appoint somebody else. So the Congress has a little bit of say over who gets in there, and of course Congress, like the president, wants to put people in there that will think like they do. So if they think that somebody's going to go in there and not be good for the country, then they'll block that person's chance to be a judge. At the same time, they can impeach, not the president. Remember, the president appoints them, but only Congress can get rid of them. But they can only get rid of them, again, for things like treason or bribery or high crimes and misdemeanors. Just not because they don't like them, it's simply they have to have a good reason to remove them from office. Now, the executive branch, well, how does it check the legislative and judicial branches? Well, it checks the legislative branches by vetoing laws. So, a law can be sent to the president, as we said, and the president can veto it. And because you need two-thirds majority to override the veto, it's sometimes very, very difficult for Congress to do that. So the president has some control over what bills are passed. Of course, the president sends the Congress suggestions on the budget and bills and things like that, but Congress doesn't have to listen to them. In terms of the executive and judicial branch, the president can appoint the judges, so they can appoint the people that's going to sit on the Supreme Court. But again, Congress gets to approve them. And the judicial branch? Well, the judicial branch can declare that the acts that the president puts out are unconstitutional. The president has the ability to issue executive orders. Executive orders are not laws of the country. They're temporary measures taken to ensure national security. If the president issues an executive order and somebody thinks that it's not fair, they can take it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can say, yes, it's constitutional, or no, it's not constitutional. So the Supreme Court can have the final say on whether a presidential executive order is fair or not. At the same time, the judicial branch can do the same thing with any laws passed by the Congress. If somebody thinks that that law is unconstitutional, that is, does not follow the Constitution of the United States of America, they can bring a court case. And eventually that court case can get to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is the ultimate court that decides if this law is constitutional or not. The people who are appointed to the Supreme Court are supposed to be the experts in the country on constitutional law. That is, they understand the Constitution better than anybody in the country. And their job is to interpret the Constitution as written with applicability to today's society to the laws that both the Congress and the president, or the executive orders that the president puts out. So we have this nice checks and balances, so no one one branch of the government can ever take full control of the government. And for the last 230 plus years or so, this has kept us pretty well in check. We have not had any types of coups or overthrows as some other countries have had. Um, Article 4 of the Constitution guarantees the states' rights. Article 4 says that, okay, we have this federal government, but within this federal government, we have to recognize that we have 50 individual entities called states. These states have rights, and the federal government cannot step on or infringe those rights. This was very, very important to the 13 original colonies. Some of the colonies felt that one state or the other was trying to be too powerful during the early days, and they wanted to guarantee that their rights were kept to them, that they did not, that a state in the South did not have to become like a state in the North. That was just not done. So therefore, states have this individual power. Every single state has its own legislative branch, executive branch, and judicial branch. They have their own constitution, and they have rights. Rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution that the federal government cannot infringe upon, and this is very, very important. This says that if one state makes a law, other states have to honor it. They don't have to follow it, but they have to honor it. So, for example, if there's a law made in New York uh, and something happens and somehow somebody who breaks the law in New York ends up in Virginia, Virginia has to honor the fact that this citizen broke the law in New York and most likely hand that person over to that state. That's also part of the concept of return fugitives. But not one state cannot force another state to make a law just because they want them to. For example, New York has very strict gun control laws. The state of Virginia does not. New York would love it for Virginia to have stricter gun control laws because we often find that criminals in New York go down to Virginia to buy a gun. We can't make them. New Yorkers cannot force Virginians to create laws that go against their nature. We have to honor the fact that they allow guns to be sold in a different manner. We have to deal with those things differently then. No state can make a treaty with a foreign government. Only the federal government can make treaties with Britain, with Mexico, with Canada. No state can form an army or a navy. It is the responsibility of the federal government to protect states from foreign invasion. That's why we have an Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, National Guard. But a Coast Guard, not National Guard, I'm sorry. So we have a Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. But a state can have what's referred to as a National Guard. This is a voluntary organization that's called out usually during times of distress, natural disasters, maybe riots, things like that. But no state has their own army, ever. And as we said, every state must return fugitives. This was originally written to return slave fugitives. Um, so if a slave left Virginia and traveled to New York but was found out, the state of New York had to return that slave, whether they agreed with slavery or not, to the state of Virginia. Nowadays, it's extradition of criminals from one state to another. So if a criminal commits a criminal act in New York and flees to Virginia, Virginia has by right to deliver that criminal back to the state of New York. Sometimes there's games involved here where that same criminal committed a crime in Virginia, so Virginia wants to try them first, not New York, and they play games, but ultimately the criminal must go back to that state if the state asks for the criminal to be returned. No state can deny returning a fugitive. So states' rights. So we've taken a look at the first four articles, basically, of the Constitution. Article 1, which deals with the executive branch. Article 1, the legislative branch. Article 2, the executive branch. Article 3, the judicial branch. And Article 4, the states' rights. And we looked at the concept of checks and balances. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and they're probably the most important amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So, come back, take a look at the third video, and then we'll be done with this part of the culture lesson.